The wealth of our country is for improving our collective wealth, but it's being poured down the drain by those who we've entrusted our government to. It is the height of extreme folly and indeed unpardonable arrogance for those who wasted our resources to now suggest that we should be punished for their waste by having to pay more taxes. The remedy that we have for restoring discipline and responsibility to the public purse of Ghana is to squeeze out the excesses by cutting out waste, instead of asking those who saw toil and sweat create the wealth of our country to pay more taxes. And welcome to Tarzan's Take. When he took office, the president of Ghana admitted that the economic of Ghana was down to its bone. There is no money to do anything in this country, and business has literally come to a grinding halt, if it ever took off at all. How to get our economic wealth and growth going is now engaging our minds and is engendering serious public debate. Tonight, we hope to bring some light and solution options into this topic by trying to find some answers to a number of questions. Namely, how did we manage to overspend our national budget by a whopping 8.7 billion Ghana cedis, nearly $4 billion US? What measures, if any, are being taken and must be taken to institute corrective actions on the over-expenditure for 2012 and those of every previous year, as has been identified by the Auditor General reports? What will be the impacts of the slew of new taxes introduced by the government on business, both corporate and of those who are in the most economically deprived classes? And last but not least, how best do we balance responsible fiscal discipline with optimal revenue generation to fuel our economic development? Join me after the break to meet with our guest, Nana Sebunsu, Chief Executive Officer of the Public Enterprise Federation, and Sidney Case-Learford, an economist, consultant, and social commentator. Join us soon.
Asam payetia obayansa foso obunubia wonka na asam tema futu sam kakre wa asupeme yo kofi o man ya woman o man ya mama.
On Wednesday, July 3rd, 2013, the Parliament of Ghana passed two bills to raise approximately 300 million Ghana cedis in the remaining 6 months of this year to help plug the gaping hole left in our national coffers by the extraordinary over-expenditure of 8.7 million Ghana cedis in the election year approved budget of 2012.
The committee, in its deliberations, considered the bill to be of an urgent nature and requested the House to take it through all the stages in one day in accordance with Article 106(13) of the Constitution and Order 119 of the Standing Orders of the House, but some members questioned the justification for the urgency.
Mr. Speaker, the committee needs to tell us. It's very important, Mr. Speaker, because, as I said, if it's additional to the budget, then certainly this is not the time to bring it. It cannot be urgent, because you need to come up with a supplementary budget to seek permission from Parliament to spend. It doesn't say so here. So I'm wondering, now I'm confused. Is the committee saying that because there's been revenue shortfalls in the first quarter, there's a need to fill the gap?
This generated heated debate in the House, with the majority leader imploring the minority leader to seek guidance from the lawyers on the minority side of the House.
Why we are saying that is that as long as a minister has constitutional functions and statutory functions to perform, those functions, he can be assisted by his deputy or deputies to perform them. This is all that the implied power here is saying. unless you have a different understanding of implied powers. And I guess the lawyers here should assist the minority leader to understand, particularly the former Attorney General, that implied powers is a legal constitutional category.
But this drew a quick response from the minority leader.
With respect to the majority leader, I don't need the assistance of senior lawyers here at all. Mr. Speaker, the words are clear, and they should be clear to the majority leader. By necessary implication of what he's saying, the president, in the absence of a cabinet minister, should invite the deputy minister to fill in. The president doesn't do that, and that should suggest to you strongly that you are wrong in this way that you are going. You are totally wrong.
The National Fiscal Stabilization Levy has been reintroduced to raise 88 million Ghana cedis through a 5% levy on profits before tax on selected companies for an 18-month period. The special imports levy, on the other hand, seeks to impose special import levy on selected import goods at the point of entry and is expected to yield approximately 206 million Ghana cedis. The imposition of these two taxes is difficult to fathom and to justify on both economic and social benefit terms. Placing additional tax burdens on companies which make profits is tantamount to suffocating the hen that lays the golden eggs, while placing taxes on goods that give social access to the most deprived is akin to playing Scrooge. There can be no greater disincentive to those who create the wealth of this nation than to signal them that the reward from the toils of their labor will not be ICOs from their government, but rather to tax away a greater portion that is normal. By the same token, placing additional taxes on fishing nets, agricultural machinery, energy-saving bulbs, mobile phones, and a slew of goods intended to assist the poorest and most vulnerable of our people to enter into productive economic activity and afford access to basic utility services at a time when so much has been poured down the waste drain is the worst form of economic double jeopardy on Ghanaians. And whatever currency you care to measure 8.7 million Ghana cedis is an enormous amount of money to throw down the drain without showing any substantial and tangible outputs and benefit to the people and nation Ghana. Indeed, the emerging evidence is of a major rape and abuse of Ghana's public purse for purely partisan and personal gains. Every ministry, every municipality, every district, every department that is dependent on the public purse, the Consolidated Fund of Ghana, overspent on its allocated budget in 2012. The worst culprit being the office of the president, which blew a whopping 700 million Ghana cedis over and above its approved 2012 budget. When public funds have been literally thrown down the drain, the most appropriate response is not to punish the few who create the wealth of our nation and the many for whom our public purse is to be used to facilitate their social and economic development. What the government rather needs to do to plug the expenditure gap is to show remorse and mea maxima culpa for its grossly irresponsible actions. The way forward to tighten the belt of the bloated public purse through the elimination of waste and achieving savings from more prudent and judicious use of our money. More than 6 months into its tenure, the government has failed to signal directly and publicly that it is declaring and will provide the leadership for a fight to eliminate the wasteful abuse of our public purse. Neither has it indicated that it is looking for ways to improve the value added from the justifiable and essential use of our funds. And yet, this is exactly what many of the countries we are so dependent on for handouts have to do themselves in response to the downturn in their economies and the growing problems of unemployment, especially among the young people. Who in Ghana would ever believe that GBC would be closed down to save money? And yet, this is what the government of Greece has done to reduce the huge burden from its profligate expenditure. Who would ever have believed that Britain, which inspired and introduced many social policies to help the poor and most vulnerable of its people, today, closing down public libraries, eliminating wasteful abuse of its welfare benefits, and seeking ways to replace generic benefits with one that is targeted towards those who really need it. Just about every EU country is taking measures to reduce its public purse to deal with the realities of slower economic growth. We should therefore not be very surprised that our benefactors have been both reluctant and slow this year to offer us the normal lift-up of plugging the gap between our expected inflows and planned expenditure through the budgetary support programs. Can we blame them for this? Hell no. When what they see is reckless abuse and misuse of their and our own money. We are just about to borrow $1 billion from the international financial markets. It is estimated that it will cost us a few $1 million in transaction fees to get this money. We have also borrowed $3 billion from China to finance much needed infrastructure projects that will give a major boost to our economic development. The total amount of $4 billion we are borrowing is less than the 8.7 million Ghana cedis of expenditure on our 2012 budget. To add salt to our already very painful injury, perhaps the most important infrastructure project that would boost our economic prospects in the short to medium term. The construction of the gas-carrying infrastructure from our oil fields has stalled because we are unable to meet our financial obligations to the project. Having entrusted our future and hopes in the government we have elected, we expect that its major priority will be to promote our welfare and our well-being through a judicious and prudent use of our public purse for our collective public good. It is unacceptable and unpardonable that when our government fails us, it doubles our pain by imposing more taxes instead of squeezing out the dripping excessive fat of personal greed and insensitive waste of our resources.
A government minister suggested that we couldn't have our cake and eat it. And if we wanted development, we needed to pay taxes. The trouble is that we've paid for the ingredients to make the cake, and somebody is eating all the cake and now asking us to pay for more ingredients so that they can make an even fatter cake. Ghana's public purse is under extreme pressure. Just last year, we spent 8.7 billion more than we budgeted for. This has been the case every year since we started the Fourth Republic. The Auditor General has written copiously, and nothing seems to have been done. And I think a problem that we face this particular year is that those who we depend on, those we beg to fill the gap in our pockets, have decided that they can no longer tolerate our irresponsibility. And so the gap has to be filled. So tonight, we have to address, how did we get into this pretty mess? How do we get out of it? And is the best way of getting out of it to squeeze those who actually make the wealth of this country. Welcome to my guest, Nana Osei-Bonsu, the Chief Executive of the Public Enterprise Federation. Private Enterprise Federation. It's moved on from being a kept body to now looking after itself. Sidney Kesley-Efford, after his Wache, financial consultant, social commentator, who's done a lot of work on how we've come to this public waste. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Sidney, if we could start with you, because I know you've done a lot of critical look at the excesses, especially of the last year. And I want us to take us through a few of them because of the thesis that we are trying to advance, that perhaps we need not have spent so much. So maybe you can give us a few things.
Okay. Maybe just a little background will help. Year after year, we tend to deficit budget, which for the layperson means that we tend to hope that even after we have spent all that we bring in from all our taxes, we will overspend that money and a little bit of extra will be given to us from somebody. Could be donors, it could be borrowing from somewhere. But normally we are running at about 1 billion to 2 billion cedis worth of extra money, which we expect to come into us from somehow, somewhere, magically. And we've been doing this consistently year after year. It doesn't mean that we've succeeded because we never get the extras that we're looking for. And we continuously overspend what we say and what we plan and what we budget. So we have continuously dragged this difference between the income, the revenue, and the expenditure out. And subsequently, year after year, we are continuously making it bigger and bigger. It has become so huge that this year, our budget even says that we are going to be loading on from outside about 8 billion cedis worth of extra spending, which we expect somebody somehow to help us to plug that gap.
What is all this oil wealth coming in? I mean, you could understand it when we're not making so much oil revenue, but why are we deficiting if there's so much oil revenue coming in?
Well, the oil revenues which were planned were based right from the very get-go, which was very, very unfortunate, that we will be making 120,000 barrels a day from the first day that we started production. And this was how we looked at it in terms of planning and budgeting going forward, not realizing that it takes a little while to ramp up. Then, of course, we also didn't realize that at a certain point, if you kept putting gas back into the system, into the wells, you create some inefficiencies, and therefore you do not get as much as you expected. So where we thought we would get 120,000 barrels a day, and we planned for that, we ended up throughout the whole of the beginning of the first year making only about some 80,000, 85,000 on average throughout the whole year. So naturally, the amount of income that we expected from the oil revenues did not materialize.
So we stepped up our expenditure in the hope that
we stepped up our expenditure based on the budget that we would be able to bring in all that extra money from the oil income. Now, the oil income is not a lot of money when you look at it compared to what we are getting or what we're expecting. I mean, I think as of last year, the first year that it was budgeted, it wasn't going to exceed 10%. It was about 9% of our total revenues that were coming in. So it wasn't really something that we should have placed so much hope on. We were going to get it somewhere down the line, but it wasn't going to come in as we thought it was, to come and show up all our problems and our challenges. So it wasn't there to have, really.
Nana, this deficit financing of our budgets, surely that is a problem for industry in the sense that if government has to borrow, it's crowding you out of the financial market. Have we been aware that this has been happening all the time, and have you reacted to it?
I think the government itself is aware of that. And one of the areas that we would prefer that government doesn't go to is the universal banks. Government has the capital markets. It goes there to borrow, and there's an accountability as to the volumes that they borrow. But when they go through the back door into the universal banks and borrow on top of that.
For the purposes of our followers, make the distinction between universal.
Universal banks are the big bank institutions like the HFC, Car Bank, Barclays Bank, and the others. And when they go there, that's the only source that private sector go to seek funding. And if I'm providing funding to a government, which is almost risk-free, default-free, why would I go and take risks with a private sector business who has a lot of gaps and constraints and, make it very difficult for me to even recoup my money? So when government goes to the banks, it pushes out the private sector. And government even borrows at a higher rate than what they borrow at the Treasury. And that's what beats our imagination. Why would they have an option where they can get lower funding or lower cost funding and then go to the financial institutions and borrow, from them? But we think that this is all because of excess expenditure.
Yes.
We have to cut our coat according to our size. As
before we get into the solutions, see, if we say we have to cut our coat according to our size, I think we want, for fairness and accuracy, to be able to pinpoint and give examples of where we believe such manifest waste can be cut without sacrificing efficiency. For example, you look at some of the numbers that have come out in 2012 and even in the Auditor General's report of 2011, there are glaring mention of waste and profligacy.
Yes.
So if we can just highlight some of these so that we can be sure that, yes, we can cut. Is because the statement made by the minister yesterday was profound, that if we want development, we must raise more taxes. And some are saying, no, we can cut. So let's show we can cut.
Well, yes, Charlie, my view is we need a trimmer, slimmer government. This government is too big. It's too bloated.
As all governments have been in the Fourth Republic. Yes.
And yet, we don't have enough institutional control and institutional supervision to be able to make things work the way they should. One of the most visible things recently has been the police force and the MTTU and their strategic positioning with trucks and cars around the various congestion points. It has worked because there's less traffic now, and the traffic flows, and they are there to intervene. So clearly, there has always been a need to have that kind of presence, and that kind of presence and recruitment needs money to support it. So even on the one hand, where we're saying we need trimmer government, we also still need institutional and supervisory control and expenditure in that direction in order for us to be able to really appreciate where our money is going. But there is a sieve. There is a financial sieve. And that financial sieve is it has some very, very big mesh holes. And that is where our corruption and our excesses are seeping through and stopping us from seeing the kind of development that we want. So even as we look at it now, and we're saying that we have targeted expenditures of 30 billion plus this year, is it necessary? Do we need to have that amount of money? And the answer is probably yes. And I say probably because if I strip out all the various things that I know are bleeding our governments and bleeding our revenues, and I say I plug those loopholes, now what do I have left to work with? Let's take a typical pet subject, education.
Right.
Do we really need to have government running schools and taking on payroll to that extent? Does government need to be looking at 270,000 teachers and deploying them across the country and then having all that expenses?
But Sydney, that's a very controversial example you are giving, because even in the highly developed economies, the role of government in education is not argued about in terms of taking on the responsibilities for teaching and paying teachers.
And I say there's a new paradigm. There's a new way of thinking about it. There's a new way of going forward. You need to look at it from a purely economic point of view now. Do we need to be doing it still? Other countries have done it very, very successfully. Even in the United States, they realized that the quality of education wasn't there and the cost of state education was too high. And they've stripped it out, come up with a charter school system that seems to be working better as they go forward. We need to look at our own and decide whether or not we can do this. Look,
but I wouldn't have thought that would be the first point of attack. There's that waste of money in so many sectors, ministries of youth and sport, the president's office.
Yes, but
surely those will be much more prime areas for...
It is the largest government expenditure. If you look on our budget, education is our largest cost base.
Yes.
That is where we spend most of our money. That's where most of the salaries are going into. That's where most of your single spine pressures are coming from. So for me, it is a very, very important and poignant point to look at immediately, because here is where you can make cost savings just like that. Look, education is booming in this country. Everywhere you go, private education is the highest, and it is the one area where private sector is thriving. It tells you that there is it gives you a message It tells you very
the
clearly.
message is that the state is failing, and therefore, because for me, that is a whole debate in itself, the issue of public versus private education. But there's all kinds, how do you justify the office of the president overspending his budget by 700 million? Or other institutions overspending their monies? These are wastes that are not controversial or debatable.
I agree with you. I agree.
And why wouldn't we look at those first before we go into areas which, for me, challenges policy? I mean, can we suggest that the office of the president will be any less efficient if it didn't overspend by 700 million, let's say?
Well, the office of the president is totally overcapacitated. There's so much extra capacity there. I don't know what the so-called Minister of Allied Services for Finance does. Okay, Fifi Kweti's position when he comes and says we can't have our cake and eat it. I don't know what his job is. I don't know whether he's supervising the Minister of Finance or whether he's supervising all the other financial MDAs that exist. I can do similar. My biggest beef these days is we have a minister whose portfolio is to look at the private-public partnerships, and we don't have a public-private partnership law. So I ask exactly what has he been doing for the last 6 months? Okay, I've been told that he has other duties to perform, fine. But he's sitting there drawing a salary and he's not doing his core job, which he's supposed to be there for. But this question now is this. I mean, I think the question you're asking here is, where are the priorities? What should we be looking at first? Yes. I didn't by any means suggest that education was the first prod. I used it as an example of how government could get trimmer. But if we are going to look at where the priorities are, the priorities definitely are in trying to stem the tide of corruption. And the question is, how do we identify those corruptible institutions and those corrupt institutions, and how do we actually put in place measures to stop them? I'm telling you that all the tools we need to stop corruption are there. They're all there. We have IOCO, we have SHRAJ, we have the
task force that the government set up.
The ministry. Well, why set up a task force when there's a ministry to do the job? There's a ministry that is supposed to be doing that job. When you set up a task force, all you're saying to them is sit back, don't do any work, we are taking charge of this, we are doing this. And yet their mandate, their job is to go out there and stop all of this that is happening within their ministries. And we don't get it done.
How is private enterprise seeing government expenditure and the over expenditure and the annual reportage of not cutting our coat according to our size? I mean, do you intervene in these things?
No, we don't intervene in that, but we try to advise that these are imprudent kind of activities that are being undertaken, and that if we exercise proper judgment, they wouldn't occur. When you have, even on Friday papers, I think there was an announcement of 200 schools to be built. In the face of profound tax that are being put on the people, on businesses, and we still going ahead and spending what we don't have. We had a 2.2 budget deficit in 2011, ballooned to 8.6 billion in 2012. On top of that, 2013, we're projecting a budget deficit of 9%. Given our accuracy in making predictions and projections,
to be 15%.
It will be 15%. And if that is coming on top of everything, and you coming back to business, the only source of revenue, tax revenue to government, to attract some more taxes, to pay some more taxes, we asking that, let's look at spending. What is the government doing? Has it prioritized its spending and the projects and the activities that they've been undertaking? Even without its tax coming on board, I was expecting government, because of the deficit in the beginning, they would themselves look within themselves and say, which areas can we prioritize? Which areas can we reduce the spending? And then come up with a framework that these are the basics that we need to do in these serious periods. Then we will look at options how to raise the funding. Coming back to business, to tax, and to levy these things coming right at this time is, to me,
you see, I want to nail this argument of spending cuts. That's why I'm looking for us to discuss specifics, because if we don't discuss specifics, somebody will say, well, you are just talking.
Sure.
So we look at 2012 and we look at 2011. Can we pinpoint the areas, some of the areas that we really think that, you know, I mean, for example, I don't understand. I lived in Margaret Thatcher's Britain, and all she said was that you run your government like you run your household budget. You budget to ensure that you don't overspend. Now you have told me that we start off by saying we are going to overspend.
Yes.
What is to stop us actually saying that we would live by what we collect?
Of course.
And why, you know, so and if you look at 2011 and the 2012, what areas, Sydney, do you see are areas that we say, okay, if we eliminate all of this, the same activity in the same ministry or department can go on without losing any efficiency?
Okay. The reasons government gave for the overspend were in about four areas.
That's right.
One was the single spine expenditures that they had to pick up.
That's right.
The other one was in the utility costs that they had to support. The third was in the petroleum retail pump price, which they had to pick up. And
When you say they had to, those were political decisions.
They were political decisions.
They didn't
Certainly.
have to.
Well, I'm saying these are the reasons they gave.
Yeah.
All right? This is what they said. And then the last one was the fact that they needed to ensure that poverty safety nets would be secured. And so that's where they spent the money. Okay? That's where they spend the money. So if we accept that.
No, we don't want to accept it. You are the analyst. I brought you here not to tell me what the government said.
Well, I have to start from
analysis.
I have to start from what the government said
Okay.
and then debunk it.
All right.
So that
Excellent.
so that
Now
my analysis is very clear. Let me take single spine. Single spine is supposed to have shot up from about 2.7 billion to nearly 7 billion, 6.77 billion. Okay. Now, as of July of 2012, government went to Parliament and said, we are 99% complete with single spine. All right? But we need another 2.5 billion to be able to take care of other things else. So Parliament approved and said, take your 2.5 and go ahead. So they did. And there were other things else that they brought up. And it was also on the back of the fact that we have extra revenues coming in. So we are sure that we will be able to balance this thing. Well, as it turned out, that wasn't what happened. Now, the TUC have made a very important point. I think yesterday's paper or the day before, or last week, Friday, where they said government should tell us exactly how much it has cost us for single spine. Okay. Put that aside. And then tell us what the other payroll pressures are that we're having to contend with. Because there's been a history of ghost payrolls, we want to make sure that these are true. We also need to identify exactly how much money went to Jeddah, for example.
Yes.
Now, my looking at Jeddah and all that we spent on there makes it very, very clear. Government went to the local open market, to the domestic market, and consistently, week after week, borrowed between 350 and 400 million CDs in short-term treasury bills.
Really?
Throughout the whole of last year. Yeah. That's what they did. They continued to do so. And that was at a cost of about some 22 to 23% interest rate on average for 91-day bills.
What did they use the money for?
And that is what we haven't got the explanation for that. But all I can see logically is that they did two things. One, they did not go to Parliament to go and get approval to spend that money, number one. Because all that money that was raised, somehow it was approved for spending, but it wasn't approved through Parliament. And I'll address how it could have been done in a few minutes. Then the other thing was, government felt that there was a lot of safety net pressure that they needed to plug. So they looked at LESDEP, NIESDEP, Beach Brigade, Jeddah, all right? And all those other
Do you classify
areas.
these as safety nets or somebody's idea of safety
This is
nets?
government's idea of safety nets.
Okay, fine.
These are supposed to be the underprivileged people who had to be supported. All that money was somehow done through the Ministry of Youth and Sports. And the sources of funding that were used for all of those were things like the Community Service Tax, the GET Fund, the District Assembly Common Fund, and a few other funds where government tapped into that and used that to support the supposed unemployed youth who needed to be employed to do something under the Ghana Youth Entrepreneurship Employment agency, JIDA.
Was PEF involved in these things?
None.
None?
None.
Private enterprise was not involved?
No.
Not
No.
in
You
any
see,
of your manifestations?
That is the bone of contention. When government disregard the private sector in all these projects that they put in place, which could be better handled by private business people, private entrepreneurs, and the public sector delivers and fails in accounting for that and fails in recouping the investment, that is what balloons the deficit. We're looking at private sector efficiency. And if you bring this into the level where it's contracted to private sector, you have accountability.
But they would argue that the people they used were private sector people.
Oh, jeez.
I think they would argue. They would argue that they were dealing with the private sector.
Well, when you pick somebody up and put them in place of what they have to do today, when they have no experience and exposure, and you have seasoned private sector participants, that is what I'm looking at, that, private sector is not consulted. But, my point really is, we want government to succeed. We want to pay taxes. But when on the power outages, on the high interest rates and other things, when we are not even making any margins of profitability, and we are not competing with the rest of the world, to come back and hunt us with this big tax legislation.
I think it's a good point.
Yeah, it's
but I want to come back to you with these taxes, but let me just clear one thing with Sydney, because I'm a bit worried. The government could go and borrow all these monies on the market without parliamentary involvement. I mean,
Certainly.
How did they do that?
Well, all right. First of all, it was totally illegal, and it shouldn't have been possible. It shouldn't have been possible. However, the system is supposed to work, that all the ministries, departments, and agencies are supposed to be given a certain cash budget allocation every month. And every month they have to bring their needs, which should be approved by the budget office of the Ministry of Finance. That budget office reports to a deputy minister, who then reports to the Minister of Finance. The ultimate authority on whether money should be released or not and spent is the Minister of Finance, above a certain level. Within certain bands, it can be done without the minister's approval. But somehow, somebody managed to give authority to the budget office, who then went ahead and released the funding and informed the Controller and Accountant General to go ahead and pay these monies. Somehow also, some of the ministries who were involved, particularly in supporting JIDA, would come and say, look, we have already agreed that we will give these people the money. If we go back now and tell them we are not going to give them, it'll create a lot of wahala. So you might as well just sign it so we carry on. So there's a lot of backdoor pressure on the Minister of Finance to go ahead and approve for payments to be made. Okay. And this is how you get to this enormous JIDA bill that we are facing.
Now let me ask you straightforward. The fiscal stabilization levy, we've had it before.
2009.
What was the impact on private sector?
It limited our ability to produce at highest levels. But because of national needs, private sector accommodated, even though it reduced our internally generated funding to a level where we had to borrow to
Did it afford profitability levels for the companies?
Definitely. Because, I mean, here you have additional taxes being laid on top of the corporate tax. So your internally generated funding, which you could have now turned into your expansion activities and all, were used to pay the additional taxes that were levied on you. As I said, yes, it impacted negatively, but we accommodated thinking that we will recoup in the near future. Now we're coming back, and this is becoming a recurring activity. Every now and then, government comes, need of national interest, let's go and do this. Here we have.
But this week you've issued a very interesting statement in which you sort of listed maybe 9 or 10 of the big issues that are afflicting the private sector. Maybe you can sort of take us through those things, because it's important for us to see how this tax is coming on top of so many different things.
You know, the importance is recognition of the difficulty and deficiencies at this time.
That's right.
Power outages, deficiency in utility deliveries, water and others, high cost of money, when others are borrowing at 3%, we are 30%. Lack of capacity. So these are items that government itself recognizes. Why do they call us a partner when there's no consultation as to raising, revenue, and it's becoming a kind of a bullet pulpit where government says, okay, this is what we need, this is what we're going to do. Let me give you an example. If we had sat at the table to recognize and decide on the shortfalls of government revenue, are there other mechanisms the government could have employed? We have tax anticipated revenue bonds that could be raised. We have a revenue anticipated bonds that the government could have put together without coming directly to tax cutlasses, farm machinery. We're looking at agriculture under the government's GSGDA, which is the Shared Growth Development Agenda. Agriculture is supposed to lead the industrialization of Ghana. You taxing cutlasses, you taxing equipment and machinery, fishing nets, all these things. So we said, okay, where are we going with this? It might be a short-term returns to you, but in the long term, in the long run, government itself is going to suffer because the profit margins of private sector is going to be reduced to a position where we almost just breaking even. And when we start just to break even, there's no opportunity for government to tax any longer. What are we going to do? Now we take plate in hand and shop around for more credit. We were near there at one time before we went HIPIC. I don't think anybody else is going to give us HIPIC opportunities anymore. Now our development partners who are supposed to come on board and help us out, they are squeezed every which ways in their own communities. How are we expecting them to continuously to supplement what we do and what we waste? Where do we go? Why don't we monitor our activities to know that, yes, indeed, we need this, we need that. Can we wait tomorrow? Can we wait the next time? What are the short-term needs? What are the short-term priorities? So instead of coming to private sector, the only source which can provide you the income. Now, private sector is going to complain. They're going to sit and say, okay, what do we do next? We have to pay. If we
are you just going to complain, or are you going to take positive measures, maybe even to slow down your production?
We're complaining to the ears of the government that let's sit down. This is unacceptable. Let me put it mildly. This is unacceptable in any form or shape. And so far as the private sector is concerned, somebody has made an investment. You see, unlike public sector where the public goods is for everybody, the private sector, individuals had made commitment with their heritage, inheritance, and their own individual resources. So when you bleed them, you're bleeding them to death on the basis of what they're going to lose.
Now, on July 3rd, I believe, the actual bill was passed. I don't even know whether the president has assented to it yet. So in reality, what is private sector going to do?
Well, when the government listens, even though there are a lot of projects, a lot of things that have been passed, the law were enacted, presidential assent and all, they still can hold off and have a thorough discussion and find viable ways of raising revenue without hurting private sector businesses. So I'm not concerned so much about it past parliament. That's a process, and that had been done. But would the government listen? For goodwill, we expect the government to listen and sit down with us, look at all the options, reduce spending. Let's look at, I include taxes of some form, but not the blanket taxes that they put on the table.
Sidney, you in your other dispensation, you work with, if you like, vulnerable people for whom some of these taxes, tax on cutlasses and things. I mean, how are they seeing these things at that level?
You know, I find that the critical inputs that people need to do their work, they will absorb it because they won't pitch themselves against government and put themselves in a position where they can't actually carry on with their businesses. But they will pass the cost to you and me.
Yeah.
So if he is going to the farm now, it is going to cost him another 20% more on his machete or his cutlass to be able to weed his farm. All he will do is to increase the price of his produce, or else he will shrink the price of the quantity of his produce and sell it to you at the same price he's selling now. They will do that because it's survival, and there's no other option for them. You are not going to see a mass rallying around by the private sector to go a luta against government and stop government.
No, but you're a
from
development
passing
economist. I mean, what's the logic in all of this? See, from where I sit as an energy person, I think the tax on CFL is madness. Because we swapped from incandescent to CFL, and that alone saved this country about 140 megawatts of new generation. We are pursuing and pushing energy efficiency and conservation.
Yes.
And the reason why CFLs are untaxed is that the capital investment is quite high. So where I sit, I find the whole thing illogical. And so from your, yes, they'll pass the cost on, but what is the impact in terms of the mixed match between policy and action at that level?
I have my views just as you have, and I find very, very illogical issues as well, just like you are finding. There is a huge net in the informal sector that government is not turning its mind to. You cannot carry on taxing the top 600 or 800 companies in this economy the way you are doing it. Eventually, they will fail.
Yeah.
And they will fail because you are not also doing anything to help bring down the interest rates in order for us to be able to get better rates to borrow at. You are still offering treasury bills at 23%. So you have already floored the ceiling. It is equivalent to a bank's base rate at 23%. Most of the banks are now calculating their base rates at about 25-26%. In order to survive, they are adding another 10% premium points onto it. So we're actually paying somewhere between 34 to 36%, all right, on interest. Business is still borrowing because it doesn't have an option. It can't turn anywhere else. We have a stock market, which if it worked very well, would provide an alternative source of less expensive money. But the stock market, for some reason, can't kick off. And despite all the advice that they are getting, they are still stuck in a hole and they can't come out of it. So that's another point. So for me, take my informal sector. The informal sector is probably between 55 to 60%
of our economy,
of our economy now. So if you just do a simple mathematical equation that we can pick up an additional tax revenue of about 12.5% on average within the informal sector, add that to my existing figures, you will get your 6 to 7 billion deficit that you're looking for.
Okay.
But our politics.
It's politics. This thing, like I said, are you hopeful that government will reverse it?
I'm not looking for government to reverse
the fiscal levy.
The fiscal stabilization levy. I'm not looking for government to reverse it in entirety, but I'm looking for government to do something.
Which is?
To reduce it, extend it in a way that it can be held off until all other options have been reviewed.
I'm sorry, Nana, but didn't they say it was for only 18 months?
18 months, yes.
Look, 18 months is a long time for a business.
Well, yes.
Okay.
3 months can collapse a business. So to me, saying that it's for a shorter period, 18 months, I said that's a no-go area. Because my revenue base is not, my pricing is not inelastic, and I cannot keep increasing my prices. And my workers are going to come back looking for us to increase their payroll because of the additional price increases in the community.
Fantastic. Well, my director is telling me that I must stop this wonderful conversation. We shall return to it. Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, Nana.
Very grateful.
Thank you all very much for listening to this wonderful conversation. My take remains that government should look to trimming its expenditure instead of loading on more taxes to the fowls that lay the golden eggs and the poor people to whom it has committed to help to get out of the poverty levels. We must, as a nation, cut our cloth according to our size and ensure that the revenues that people contribute by way of taxes are used judiciously to help the people to improve their livelihoods and well-being. and not used to abuse expenditure at election times so that people can continue to hold on to power. Thank you.